There are many ways that you can be blinded. You can be blind from birth. You can become blinded. You can be blinded by faith. You can be blinded by fear. The telltale symptom in this story, the people who were blinded, is that they all seemed to see perfection wherever they looked. Experts look at the Cold War crises and they see perfection. They see nuclear deterrence working in every crisis. But you can only reach that conclusion by turning a blind eye to some important facts. Consider Cuba. Experts interpreted the crisis as evidence that nuclear deterrence works. After all, the Soviets put nuclear missiles into Cuba, there was a risk of nuclear war, and then they took them out. So that, you might imagine, is clear proof that nuclear deterrence works. But they don't think about what Kennedy did. JFK knew that if he blockaded Cuba, they ran the risk of nuclear war. In the series of secret meetings that they held in the week before deciding on U.S. strategy, they mentioned the risk of nuclear war 60 times. So they obviously knew what the stakes were. They knew that if they blockaded Cuba, there was a risk of nuclear war, and then they went ahead and did it anyway. Experts point to the actions of Henry Kissinger, who put U.S. nuclear forces on a higher level of alert as a way of warning the Soviets not to put troops into Egypt. And they didn't put troops into Egypt. So, experts say, obviously nuclear deterrence worked. But they don't ask themselves, what about Sadat and Assad, the leaders of Egypt and Syria? Everyone knew Israel had nuclear weapons. It had been reported in the New York Times. So why weren't Sadat and Assad deterred by Israel's nuclear weapons? They looked at Israel's nuclear arsenal. They knew about the danger of attacking a small country like Israel, where they would feel any attack was an existential threat. And then, knowing that danger, they launched a war. Finally, think about the Gulf War. Kevin Chilton, General Kevin Chilton, at one time commander of all U.S. nuclear forces, says, along with other experts, that it proves that nuclear deterrence works. You may remember Secretary of State James Baker delivers a letter to the Iraqis that says, don't use chemical or biological weapons, or if you do, we'll have recourse to measures of great force, or whatever the euphemism is. And in fact, the Iraqis didn't use chemical or biological weapons, so according to Chilton and other experts, this proves that nuclear deterrence works. But read the letter more closely, and you find that it actually draws 3 red lines in the sand. Don't use chemical or biological weapons, don't set the oil wells on fire, and don't make terroristic attacks against our friends and allies. And as everyone knows, the Iraqis crossed 2 of those red lines. They set the oil wells on fire, and they fired Scud missiles at Israeli civilians. So, does that mean that deterrence works 1 time out of 3? These are just 3 examples. But every one of the Cold War crises has elements that throw doubt on the reliability of nuclear deterrence. Experts conclude that nuclear deterrence worked in every crisis, but they do that only by turning a blind eye to some of the evidence. Again and again, leaders saw the danger of nuclear war and then plunged ahead with risky and aggressive actions. None of these failures led to nuclear war, but that was the result of luck, not because nuclear deterrence works like magic. And the way to see this is to think about the U-2 crisis at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's a U-2. It's flying over the North Pole gathering air samples or something. And it malfunctions. The navigation equipment malfunctions, and it strays off course 300 miles inside the Soviet Union. The Soviets see it on radar, and they scramble MiGs to shoot it down. Pilot eventually figures out he's lost, and he sends a mayday back to the base, and they scramble F-102s to find it and escort it back to base. The problem is, though, that it's the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and some mid-level military official has decided that all of the conventional air-to-air missiles should be removed from the U.S. F-102s and replaced with Falcon nuclear air-to-air missiles. So those U.S. fighters, the only armament they had were nuclear missiles. If those two groups of jets had found each other over the Soviet Union, there would have been a nuclear explosion over Russia and likely a nuclear war. They didn't find each other. But that was just because we were lucky, not because deterrence is a machine that cannot fail. Why do experts see each crisis and imagine that they see the perfect functioning of nuclear deterrence? I think the reason is fear. The Cold War, remember, terrified people. They felt trapped between two imperatives. On the one hand, they felt as if their world might end at any moment. But on the other hand, they felt that nuclear weapons were necessary. They were stuck. So they prayed that nuclear deterrence was really keeping them safe. They indulged in wishful thinking. Fear blinded them. I don't think there's any doubt that deterrence works sometimes. Ordinary deterrence probably deters crime some of the time. Nuclear war is frightening. The problem is that with nuclear deterrence, some of the time is not good enough. Any failure of nuclear deterrence could lead to a catastrophic war. You could say for nuclear deterrence that failure is not an option. Experts say that nuclear deterrence won't fail, can't fail, works perfectly, but only a blind man could reach that conclusion. Nuclear deterrence has failed and could fail. Sometimes leaders were restrained by the risk of nuclear war, but sometimes not. The problem is that nuclear deterrence is not a mechanism. It's a relationship between people, and we are fundamentally fallible. Human beings are capable of breathtaking folly, and so we are bound to make mistakes. It's in our nature. Nuclear deterrence, by definition, cannot function perfectly forever. It is not safe and reliable. It is much more like Russian roulette. And if we continue to play, one day we'll all lose. We were blinded by fear. Afraid that nuclear weapons were necessary, we turned a blind eye to the evidence that it could fail. The most powerful nations in the world, equipped with the most dangerous weapons, have based their safety and security on wishful thinking.